Sit down now. You're not free to move.
By being detained on what grounds?
You're standing where you shouldn't be.
This is a public waiting area.
Not for you. Hands on your knees.
I'm traveling, but you're escalating
Backup's
without
on route.
cause.
The rookie officer had been on the force for 14 months. Assigned to overnight transportation hub patrols where supervisors were sparse and decisions rarely faced immediate scrutiny, he had developed in that time a particular pattern of conduct that his evaluations had framed generously, assertive, confident, willing to take control of uncertain situations. 3 complaints had been filed against him in 14 months. All 3 described the same behavior: escalation without cause, disproportionate commands, and a tone that shifted depending on who was standing in front of him. All 3 had been reviewed. All 3 had been absorbed into the category of learning curve and set aside. He would not be given a 4th. What the officer did not know, what he was less than 48 hours away from understanding in the most career-ending way possible, was that the black man he had just ordered to sit on a bench in a public ferry terminal was Colonel David Monroe. 31 years of uniformed service. Commander of a National Guard unit responsible for multi-state emergency coordination across 4 regional districts. A man who had managed crisis operations during floods, wildfires, and infrastructure failures, who had disciplined officers for exactly this kind of conduct, and who had, on more than one occasion, rewritten the protocols that were supposed to prevent it. The backup officer who arrived would recognize him. Internal Affairs would be notified before the shift ended. The footage would reach 4 million views. And the rookie officer who had treated a public bench like an interrogation chair would be terminated before the month was out, not transferred, not retrained, terminated, for conduct unbecoming in violation of constitutional detention standards. But none of that had happened yet. The fog was still thick. The terminal lights still cast their dull orange halos across wet concrete. And Colonel David Monroe was sitting exactly where he had been told to sit, hands visible, back straight, waiting. Before this story goes any further, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments right now. And if you believe a public waiting area should be exactly that, public, for everyone, like this video and subscribe. These stories deserve an audience until they stop being necessary. David Monroe had not planned to be awake before 5 in the morning. The regional coordination briefing had been moved up 12 hours following the conclusion of a multi-state emergency readiness exercise, and his assistant had sent the revised schedule at 11 the previous night with the particular apologetic brevity of someone who had delivered unwelcome news enough times to know that explanation didn't help. Monroe had read it, set his alarm, and slept without difficulty. 31 years of irregular hours had made adaptability less a skill than a baseline. He was on his way to a facility, 2 ferry crossings and 1 connecting transport from where he lived, a route he had made more times than he could account for, familiar enough to navigate half asleep, which was approximately the state he was in when he packed his overnight bag and left the house in the dark. He dressed the way he always dressed when traveling between posts without ceremony: plain coat, dark trousers, unbranded bag, nothing that announced rank or affiliation. He had learned early in his career that authority worn on the outside invited the wrong kind of attention and earned the wrong kind of respect. What mattered was the work. The uniform came out when the occasion required it. This morning did not require it. He arrived at the ferry terminal at 4:47, joined the pedestrian queue in the designated waiting area, set his bag at his feet, and checked his watch once. The first ferry departure was scheduled for 5:15. He had time. He looked out toward the water, where the fog had reduced the visible distance to roughly 30 feet, and where the low sound of the current against the dock was the only consistent presence in an otherwise quiet morning. He had done this crossing hundreds of times. It was supposed to be routine. The ferry terminal existed in its own suspended atmosphere before dawn, the kind of place that functions at the edge of the city's awareness, operational and purposeful but invisible to anyone not passing through it. Sodium lights mounted above the pedestrian lanes cast pools of amber across wet concrete. The fog had settled low and even, softening edges, muffling the idle hum of engines from the car queue that stretched back along the access road. Water moved steadily against the pier in short, rhythmic intervals. A handful of passengers occupied the waiting area in the particular disconnected quiet of people sharing space without sharing anything else. Monroe stood near the pedestrian railing with his bag at his feet, coat zipped against the damp cold, hands visible at his sides. He was not doing anything. He was waiting, which was the only thing the space existed to facilitate. The officer came in from the left, footsteps sharp against the concrete, pace carrying the forward momentum of someone who had already decided on an approach before completing the assessment that should have preceded it. He was young, early 20s, posture rigid in the way that substitutes for authority when authority hasn't been earned yet, and he moved directly into Monroe's space without pause, without greeting, without the preliminary observation that the situation neither required nor suggested he had performed. He demanded Monroe step back from the railing. Monroe stepped back. 2 measured paces. No comment. His hands remained visible. The officer asked what he was doing at the terminal at this hour. Monroe answered. Waiting for the ferry. The answer was complete because the situation was complete. There was nothing more to add. The officer circled him once, flashlight cutting across the coat, the bag, the face, a sweep that found nothing because there was nothing to find, but which communicated its intended message regardless, that presence here, at this hour, in this body, required justification that had not yet been satisfactorily provided. A few passengers in the queue had stopped the minimal movement of early morning waiting and were watching with the careful stillness of people who recognize a situation accelerating past its appropriate threshold. Monroe did not track the officer's movement with his eyes. He faced forward, hands at his sides, and allowed the inspection to complete itself without reaction. His breathing was even. His posture was the posture of someone who had stood at attention in conditions considerably more demanding than a foggy dock and had understood, for 31 years, that composure was not a performance. It was infrastructure. The officer asked if he was alone. Monroe confirmed he was. The officer asked why he was really there. Monroe repeated his answer without alteration. The officer's tone shifted at the repetition, not because the answer had changed, but because its consistency read, in the officer's particular interpretive framework, as defiance rather than accuracy. He circled again. Closer this time. Monroe noted the reduction in distance without responding to it. He had trained officers to understand proxemics as a de-escalation tool, the deliberate management of physical space in volatile situations to prevent the situation from becoming more volatile. What the officer was doing was the inverse, closing distance not to calm but to dominate, using proximity as a form of pressure in a situation that had generated no cause for pressure. It was a textbook error. Monroe had written, at various points in his career, the section of the textbook that named it. The passengers who had been watching were no longer pretending not to. 3 phones had risen to angles that suggested recording rather than reading. A woman near the ticket structure had stopped moving entirely, her rolling bag abandoned beside her, her attention fixed on the exchange with the particular quality of a witness who understands she is watching something she will be asked to describe later. The officer declared that Monroe's presence remained unexplained to his satisfaction. Monroe asked, with the same measured register he had maintained throughout, for the specific legal basis of the detention. The officer's response did not provide one. It provided a command, sit down, on the bench, hands on knees, delivered in a volume calibrated to the audience rather than the necessity, and Monroe understood in that moment that the situation had passed the point where clarification was the officer's objective. Control was the objective. The distinction mattered enormously and would matter more before the morning was finished. He sat. Back straight. Hands placed exactly where he had been told to place them. The bench was cold and slightly damp and faced the water, and Monroe looked out toward the fog with the undivided calm of someone who had decided, some time ago, that he was going to get through this with more precision than the person causing it had prepared to encounter. The officer stood over him and keyed his radio. His voice when he spoke to dispatch carried the particular tightness of someone narrating a situation upward in a way designed to make it sound larger than it was, justifying, in real time, the decisions already made. He used the word uncooperative. Monroe, who had not raised his voice or moved without instruction or provided any response other than factual answers to direct questions, noted the word and filed it with the same methodical attention he had applied to every other detail of the morning. The officer paced. He issued contradictory commands in sequence, stand up, now sit, move here, stay there, each one less about positioning than about the maintenance of visible authority in front of an audience that was growing less comfortable with what it was watching. The metallic sound of a cuff being unclipped from a belt cut through the ambient noise of the terminal with the particular sharpness of an action taken in public that the public has not consented to witness. Monroe rose when instructed. He turned when instructed. He allowed his wrists to be drawn behind him without resistance, without comment, without any of the physical escalation that the officer's behavior might have been designed to provoke. The handcuffs closed. The sound they made was small and definitive, and it moved through the waiting area the way a wrong note moves through a quiet room, not loudly, but with the quality of something that cannot be taken back. A gasp from somewhere in the crowd. A whispered exchange near the railing. Someone said the word unnecessary into the silence, and the silence did not dispute it. Monroe stood with his wrists bound behind him and his coat still zipped and his overnight bag still at his feet on the wet concrete, and he looked out toward the water with the same unhurried steadiness he had carried throughout. He did not perform composure for the cameras. He did not require the audience's sympathy or their attention. He was simply, precisely, exactly what he had always been, a man who understood that how you hold yourself under pressure determines what the pressure ultimately produces. Headlights swept across the dock from the access road, diffused by the fog into a broad, pale wash of light that arrived before the vehicle was visible. The crowd's attention shifted. The rookie officer straightened his shoulders, turning slightly toward the approaching cruiser with the confidence of someone whose version of events was about to receive reinforcement. The restrained man did not turn. He lifted his gaze slightly toward the water, and in the quality of that stillness, unhurried, unafraid, oriented not toward escape but toward what came next, there was something that the fog and the orange lights and the small cold sounds of the terminal could not quite contain. The backup vehicle came to a stop. A door opened. A second officer stepped out onto the concrete, and before he had taken 3 steps toward the scene, something in his bearing changed, not dramatically, not with the visible shift of surprise, but with the quiet, professional recalibration of someone whose eyes have just delivered information that his training knows exactly how to process. The rookie officer had not noticed. He was still composing his briefing, still arranging the narrative that would justify the morning, still standing in the full confidence of a man who believed the ground beneath his authority was solid. It was not. The backup officer did not move with the urgency the rookie had expected. He closed the distance from his vehicle to the scene at a measured pace, eyes already working, not scanning for threat, but reading the composition of what had assembled itself in the fog. The crowd first. Their posture, their phones, the particular quality of collective discomfort that distinguishes a scene people are witnessing from one they are merely observing. Then the rookie, standing with the forward lean of someone mid-justification, already narrating before an audience had formally presented itself. Then the restrained man on the bench. He stopped there. Not visibly. Not in a way that announced itself. But the economy of his movement changed, the slight recalibration of a trained observer who has registered something that doesn't align with the framework the situation presented on approach. The man's wrists were bound. His coat was zipped. His bag sat undisturbed at his feet. His posture was vertical and exact in the way that posture becomes when it has been required for decades rather than performed for an occasion, and the stillness he occupied was not the stillness of someone subdued. It was the stillness of someone waiting, with full awareness, full composure, and the particular patience of a person who understood that the situation would resolve itself correctly if he simply allowed it the time to do so. The backup officer approached him directly. He ignored the rookie's preliminary briefing, not dismissively, but in the way a senior reader ignores a summary when the primary document is available. He stopped in front of the restrained man, made eye contact, and asked, quietly and with the neutral register of a question that expected an honest answer, whether he could see some identification. Monroe nodded once. He directed the officer to his coat pocket, narrating each movement before making it with the practiced transparency of someone who had trained others in exactly this protocol: announce, move slowly, stop if asked. The backup officer reached in himself, withdrew the identification card, and looked at it. The shift in his expression was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was the compression of recognition into the smallest visible form, a slight stillness around the eyes, a fractional adjustment of weight, the moment before a professional response assembles itself over a personal reaction. He read the name. He read the rank. He read the branch insignia and the command designation, and then he looked up at the men in front of him with the specific quality of attention that forms when two pieces of information, what you expected and what is, refuse to occupy the same space. He handed the identification back with both hands. Then he brought his right hand up in a formal salute. The motion was clean and unhurried and entirely precise, and it passed through the assembled crowd at the ferry terminal the way a sound passes through a space that has been holding its breath, sudden, clarifying, and impossible to misinterpret. A woman near the ticket structure exhaled audibly. Someone said something in a low voice that the fog absorbed before it reached full sentence. The phones that had been raised at careful angles did not lower. They steadied. The rookie officer stared. His mouth opened slightly, then closed. The crowd at that terminal had a choice in that moment: speak up or stay silent. Most had already made it with their cameras. But if you had been standing on that dock, what would you have done? Type speak or silent in the comments and tell us what you think you would have chosen, and why. There is no wrong answer. Only an honest one. What the footage circulating online would not show, what would only emerge in the days following, through the coordination briefing Monroe eventually attended and the institutional trail it left behind, was the particular irony embedded in the morning's events. Monroe had not simply been traveling to a regional meeting. He had, in the preceding 18 months, contributed to a working group tasked with reviewing civilian-police interaction protocols at public transportation hubs. The working group's report, submitted to 3 state agencies and currently under review for policy integration, had identified early morning transportation hub patrols as environments of elevated risk for bias-based stops, isolated, low supervision settings where officers defaulted to assumption in the absence of oversight. It had recommended specific reforms, mandatory articulation standards before any detention, bodycam activation requirements, and supervisory notification thresholds for stops involving members of the public who were not actively engaged in observable misconduct. The officer who had just handcuffed him had violated every standard the report had named. Monroe had written the section on restraint. The backup officer turned to the rookie and spoke with the flat, precise economy of someone who had already completed his assessment and was now delivering its conclusion. He identified the absence of any articulated legal basis for the detention. He noted the use of restraints in a situation that had generated no documented threat. He noted the failure to verify identification through available channels before escalating to physical control. He ordered the handcuffs removed. The rookie's confidence did not collapse loudly. It evacuated. One moment it was present, the forward posture, the ready justification, the certainty of a man whose narrative had not yet met its contradiction, and then the salute had happened, and the identification had been returned with 2 hands, and the backup officer was dismantling the morning's decisions in sequential order, and there was nothing available to fill the space that certainty had occupied. He removed the cuffs. The metallic sound they made returning to his belt was smaller than the sound they had made going on. Monroe brought his hands forward. He adjusted his coat once, a single motion, unhurried. He did not look at the rookie. He did not address the crowd. He reached down and picked up his overnight bag from the wet concrete where it had sat untouched through the entire duration of what had just occurred, and he straightened with the complete composure of a man whose internal architecture had not shifted by a single degree from the moment the first command had been issued to this one. The watching crowd's collective posture changed. The wariness that had been present in the early minutes, the tentative, suspended quality of people uncertain whether they were witnessing something that required response, had resolved into something clearer and less comfortable. A few people near the railing spoke to each other in low voices. The woman with the rolling bag had not lowered her phone. A retired-looking man near the queue nodded once, slowly, at nothing in particular, the way people nod when a thing they suspected has been confirmed. The backup officer's report was filed before the shift ended. It was 4 paragraphs. It was factual, sequential, and contained no language that could be read as ambiguous. Failure to articulate reasonable suspicion. Detention without legal basis. Application of restraints absent documented justification. Escalation pattern inconsistent with departmental protocol. He attached his bodycam timestamp log and noted the presence of multiple civilian recording devices. Internal Affairs received the file that morning. By the following evening, the footage had completed its movement through the online infrastructure that amplifies these moments. First the platforms where veterans and civil rights communities distribute material, then the broader channels where volume creates visibility, then the news cycle that treats viral footage as both story and source. The clip that spread fastest was not the salute, though the salute spread widely. It was the 30 seconds before the salute, Monroe seated on the bench, hands on knees, posture exact, while the officer paced in front of him with the restless energy of someone performing authority for an audience that had stopped believing in the performance. The contrast required no caption. The investigation moved with the speed that investigations move when the evidence is comprehensive and the documentation is unambiguous. The rookie officer's personnel file was reviewed in full. The 3 prior complaints emerged not as isolated incidents but as a sequence, each one describing a version of the same behavioral signature, each one closed without action, each closure now recontextualized by the morning's events into something the department could no longer frame as a learning curve. He was terminated before the month ended. The decision was delivered without the softening language of transfer or retraining. The termination documentation cited conduct unbecoming, violation of constitutional detention standards, and a pattern of escalatory behavior that prior reviews had identified and failed to address. The backup officer received a formal commendation. His report was designated required reading for all probationary officers assigned to transportation hub patrols. 3 policy revisions followed within 60 days. Mandatory articulation standards were introduced for any stop occurring in designated public waiting areas. Bodycam activation requirements were extended to all transportation hub assignments regardless of shift duration. A supervisory notification threshold was established for any detention involving a subject who had not been observed engaged in specific, documentable conduct. The revisions were dry and procedural and written in the language that institutional documents use to convert human failure into structural correction. They did not name Monroe. They did not need to. The ferry departed at 5:17, 2 minutes behind schedule. Monroe boarded with the other passengers, bag over one shoulder, moving through the ramp in the middle of the queue without acknowledgement or separation from the flow of ordinary commuters. He found a seat near the window on the water side and set his bag on the bench beside him. The terminal receded as the vessel pulled away from the dock, the orange light softening further into the fog until they were indistinguishable from the general gray of the early morning. He checked his watch. He would be on time for the briefing. The dock returned to its operational rhythm within minutes, the next departure queue forming, the ticket window opening, the ambient sounds of engines and water reasserting themselves over the residual tension the morning had left behind. The bench where Monroe had sat was occupied again before the fog had fully lifted, by a man in work clothes who set down his coffee and looked at his phone without any awareness of what the surface beneath him had briefly held. The moment did not announce its own significance. It rarely does. What had happened at that terminal was not, in its essential nature, a story about rank. Rank was how it resolved. It was not why it mattered. What mattered was the 40 minutes before the backup cruiser arrived, the composed man asking reasonable questions, the officer confusing the absence of submission for the presence of threat, the crowd watching a public space become something it was not designed to be. That sequence would have been wrong in exactly the same way if Monroe had been traveling without a title. His rank ended the detention. It did not define the injustice. Authority without discipline is not authority. It is pressure applied in the shape of authority, and it holds only until something more durable arrives to stand beside it. What stood beside it that morning, patient and exact and entirely unmoved, had been there from the beginning, waiting, as it had always waited, for the fog to thin enough for everyone present to see it clearly. It did not need to announce itself. It never had.
If you like this video, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next story. Share this video with someone who would appreciate it, and let's keep building this community together. And before you go, drop a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what stood out to you the most. Until next time, stay safe, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next.